In the pre-dawn gloom of June 4, 1942, numerous young Japanese aviators sit in their cockpits aboard 4 aircraft carriers, inhaling deeply the Pacific morning air. Others are receiving briefings in ready rooms, reviewing their target maps one last time. Still others, mechanics and deckhands, are making final adjustments to planes that will soon ascend into history. Unbeknownst to them, 240 miles to the northeast, 3 American carriers are already turning into the wind, preparing to launch their own assaults. In a matter of hours, what was intended to be Japan's decisive triumph, the destruction of American carrier strength in the Pacific, would instead become the Empire's most disastrous defeat. For Japanese carriers that had dominated at Pearl Harbor would slip beneath the waves, carrying with them not only steel and fuel but the ambitions of Japanese expansion and over 3,000 irreplaceable airmen and sailors. This had been the culmination of 6 months of victories. And now, for the first time, this critical battle would be seen through the eyes of those who suffered its consequences, the Japanese admirals who orchestrated it, the pilots who executed it, and the sailors who perished. This is the Battle of Midway. It is the spring of 1942, 2 months before disaster would strike at Midway. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, is embroiled in heated disputes with the Naval General Staff. Events are not unfolding as smoothly as the public believes. The previous December's strike on Pearl Harbor, though tactically brilliant, had failed to destroy a single American aircraft carrier. This reality torments Yamamoto constantly. The USS Enterprise and USS Lexington had been absent at sea during the attack. And now, 6 months later, these carriers continue to harass Japanese forces across the Pacific. Worse still, on April 18, American B-25 bombers launched from the USS Hornet had appeared in Tokyo's skies. The minor raid, an unimaginable humiliation for the Japanese military sworn to protect the emperor, inflicted minimal physical damage but triggered a psychological shockwave within Japanese leadership. The homeland's vulnerability had been exposed, and someone had to bear responsibility. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, was particularly rattled. Criticized for not launching a third wave at Pearl Harbor, for failing to locate the American carriers, and now seeing Tokyo itself bombed, the pressure for a decisive response was immense, yet the Japanese high command remained deeply divided. Within the halls of power, 2 opposing strategies emerged. The Naval General Staff, conservative and cautious, favored a southern approach, solidifying gains in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, severing supply lines between America and Australia. But Yamamoto envisioned a different path, one born of both opportunity and urgency. He knew something few others in Japan fully grasped: time was not on their side. During his years in the United States, studying at Harvard and serving as a naval attaché, Yamamoto had witnessed American industrial capacity firsthand. He had seen the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of Newport News, and the vast farmlands capable of sustaining millions of workers. Once America's war machine reached full production, Japan would be overwhelmed by sheer material superiority. As Yamamoto told Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono in a documented 1940 conversation, "If we are ordered to do it, I can guarantee a tough fight for the first 6 months, but I have no confidence regarding what would happen if it lasted 2 or 3 years." This prophecy would prove uncannily accurate. In another verified statement from September 1941, he warned, "For a while we will have everything our way, extending in every direction like an octopus stretching its tentacles, but it will last at most a year and a half." The solution, Yamamoto argued, was Operation MI, the capture of Midway. These tiny islands, just 6 square miles of coral and sand, held strategic significance far beyond their size. Positioned 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, Midway was America's westernmost outpost, a crucial refueling hub for submarines and aircraft patrolling the Central Pacific. More importantly for Yamamoto, Midway would serve as irresistible bait, drawing American carriers out from Pearl Harbor. When they came to defend the atoll, the superior Japanese fleet would annihilate them in a decisive engagement, the Kaikessen envisioned in Japanese naval doctrine. The plan was intricate, perhaps overly so, involving multiple forces operating across thousands of miles of ocean, an invasion fleet to seize Midway, a carrier strike force to neutralize American air power, a main fleet including Yamamoto's flagship, the formidable Yamato, and even a diversionary attack on the Aleutians to confuse the Americans. Some 200 vessels in total, the largest fleet Japan had ever mustered. The operation order alone spans 700 pages, distributed mere days before sailing, leaving subordinate commanders little time to study it. Opposition to the plan was significant but ultimately ineffective. Rear Admiral Mitomagaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, conducted wargames in early May that revealed troubling outcomes. In the tabletop exercises, American carriers appeared sooner than anticipated and inflicted severe damage on the Japanese fleet. Yet these results were overruled. The umpires arbitrarily reduced American hits and refloated Japanese ships sunk during the simulations. When Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical planner of the Pearl Harbor attack, voiced concerns about the operation's complexity and the vulnerability of the carriers, he was dismissed. The victory disease, fatal overconfidence bred from 6 months of easy conquests, had infected even the sharpest minds of the Imperial Navy. The Japanese believed they had sunk 2 American carriers at the Coral Sea in May, when in fact only the USS Lexington had been lost. They assumed the USS Yorktown was so badly damaged it would be out of action for months. Japanese intelligence had failed to detect the frantic repair efforts at Pearl Harbor, where 1,400 workers labored around the clock to restore Yorktown in just 3 days, a feat Japanese shipyards could never have achieved. They calculated the Americans could have at most 2 operational carriers to oppose them. Meanwhile, the man chosen to lead the carrier strike force, Vice Admiral Churchi Nagamo, harbored his own deep doubts. Nagamo was not a carrier admiral by training or temperament. A torpedo specialist who had been appointed to command the 1st Air Fleet. More by seniority than expertise. He had never been comfortable with naval aviation. At Pearl Harbor, his caution had prevented a 3rd strike that might have destroyed the American fuel depots and repair facilities. Now he was being asked to lead an even more complex operation with an increasingly worn-out force. His carriers had been at sea almost continuously since Pearl Harbor, striking Darwin, Ceylon, and supporting operations from the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea. His air crews were exhausted, and the ships needed maintenance. Most troublingly, the recent Battle of the Coral Sea in May had cost Japan dearly. While tactically a Japanese victory with the sinking of the Lexington, strategically it was a setback. The carrier Shokaku had been badly damaged and would need months of repairs. Her sister ship Suikoku had lost so many aircraft and pilots that she could not participate in the Midway operation. 2 of Japan's best carriers would be absent from the decisive battle. As Nagamo confided to his chief of staff, Captain Ryunosuke Kosaka, "We are being asked to do too much with too little. The Americans have had time to prepare. Our pilots are tired, and we don't even know where their carriers are." Yamamoto is gambling with the fate of the empire. But perhaps the most fatal flaw in the Japanese plan was one of intelligence and mindset. Unknown to the Japanese, the Americans had broken the Japanese Navy's JN-25B code. Commander Joseph Rashford, stationed Hypo at Pearl Harbor, had been reading Japanese messages since early 1942. The Americans knew about Operation MI. Knew the target was Midway, confirmed through the famous AF ruse, where Midway broadcast false reports of water shortage via secure cable, then intercepted Japanese messages that AF was short on water and knew the approximate date of the attack. Admiral Chester Nimitz had complete Japanese order of battle and could position his forces accordingly. The Japanese submarine cordon meant to detect American ships leaving Pearl Harbor would arrive on station too late. The American carriers had already passed through. The planned reconnaissance by flying boats of Pearl Harbor, Operation K, was cancelled when submarine Natapshad 123 found American warships USS Thornton and USS Pelba occupying French frigate shoals, the intended refueling point. This had worked in March when 2 Kawanishi H-8K flying boats had refueled. They're from submarines to bomb Oahu, but Nimitz had learned from that raid. One by one, the eyes that might have warned of the American ambush were being blinded. Radio intelligence did indicate increased American submarine activity and message traffic around Midway. The ease with which the Americans had found Japanese forces at Coral Sea suggested their codes might be compromised. But these warnings were dismissed. As one staff officer put it, the Americans are too stupid to break our codes and too cowardly to fight unless they have overwhelming superiority. They will come to Midway only after we have taken it, and then we will destroy them. On May 27, the anniversary of Admiral Togo's great victory over the Russians at Tsushima, Nagumo's carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, sailed from the inland sea. 4 carriers departed. Akagi, Red Castle, Yamamoto's former command, and Nagumo's flagship. Kaga, Increased Joy, the converted battleship. Hiryū, Flying Dragon, and Sōryū, Green Dragon. Between them they carried 248 aircraft, including 2110 being fed to Midway with 225 operational for combat and the most experienced naval aviators in the world. These were the ships and men who had devastated Pearl Harbor, who had rampaged from Hawaii to Ceylon. Surely nothing could stop them. Commander Minoru Gender, still recuperating from his emergency appendectomy, but serving as Nagumo's air operations officer despite his illness, made a final entry in his diary. Before departure, we sail with heavy hearts. This operation has been rushed. Our intelligence is poor, and the plan is too complex. But we are samurai. We will do our duty even if it leads to death. May the gods protect Japan, for I fear we sail toward catastrophe. The fatal flaw of overconfidence was perhaps best exemplified by the treatment of Commander Mitsuo Fuita, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack. In late May, Fuita underwent an emergency appendectomy aboard Akagi. The surgery left him too weak to fly, depriving the Japanese of their most experienced strike leader at the most critical moment. According to later testimony from other officers, Fuita watched the preparations from his sick bed with growing unease, sensing that everything about this operation felt wrong. The timing, the plan, the very air itself seemed heavy with impending doom. However, historians note that Fuita's post-war accounts must be treated with caution, as modern scholarship has challenged many of his claims. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 3, 600 m2, the north, the Aleutian Islands operation begins. Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakutoa's 2nd Carrier Strike Force with the light carriers Ryūjo and Juno launches strikes against Dutch Harbor in Alaska. This is meant to be the Great Diversion, pulling American forces north while Nagumo attacks Midway. But unknown to the Japanese, the Americans have not taken the bait. Admiral Chester Nimitz, fully informed by his codereekers of the real target, has kept his carriers at Midway. The elaborate deception has deceived no one but the Japanese themselves. Meanwhile, Nagumo's carriers steam through fog toward their launch point, maintaining strict radio silence that will prevent any coordination between the widely separated forces. In the ready rooms, pilots receive their final briefings. Lieutenant Joy Tamanega, who will lead the first strike, studies the reconnaissance photos of Midway one last time. The images are weeks old, but they show the airfield, the fuel tanks, the defensive positions. What they don't show is the recent reinforcement of the island, the additional fighters, bombers, and most crucially, the radar station that will detect the Japanese strike while it's still 93 miles away. That evening, American PBY Catalina flying both spot portions of the Japanese invasion fleet 700 m west of Midway. This first contact electrifies the American command. Navy pilot Ian Jack Reed flying a PBY reports at 0925. Sighted main body bearing 262 distance 700. But Nagumo's carriers remain undetected, hidden by weather and distance. On the bridge of Akagi, the tension is palpable. Chief of Staff Kusaka approaches Nagumo. Sir, if the Americans have spotted the invasion force, they may be more alert than we expected. Nagumo dismisses the concern. The invasion force is supposed to be seen. It will draw them out. Tomorrow, we will destroy their air power on Midway. And when their carriers arrive to counterattack, we will be waiting. But even as Nagumo speaks these confident words, 300 m to the northeast, Admiral Raymond Spruant aboard USS Enterprise is plotting the Japanese carrier fork's probable position. The American carriers are exactly where they shouldn't be according to Japanese calculations. Already at sea, already in position, already preparing to strike. Task Force 16 under Spruant with Enterprise and Hornet, and Task Force 17 under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher with the hastily repaired Yorktown have reached Point Luck, their designated rendezvous northeast of Midway, undetected by any Japanese reconnaissance. The weather is clear, the seas calm, perfect flying conditions with visibility extending for miles. At precisely 0430, Akagi and Kaga begin launching the first wave against Midway. The launch proceeds smoothly. 36 ID-3 Naval dive bombers, 36 Nakajima, B-5 and Kate level bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. Lieutenant Tominaga leads them into the lightning sky, circling once over the fleet before heading southeast toward Midway, 240 miles distant. As the 108 aircraft form up and depart, Nagumo makes his first fateful decision of the day. Despite doctrine calling for a full deckload strike to maximize impact, he holds back 108 aircraft. Kate's armed with Type 91 torpedoes and 800 kilograms armor-piercing bombs in case American ships appear. It seems prudent, but it will prove catastrophic. Below decks in the hangar of Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuida watches the launch from his sick bed, still recovering from his appendectomy. The absence of his experience and tactical genius will be keenly felt in the hours to come. According to witness accounts from other officers, Fukuda expressed deep concern about the operation, though his specific words remain unverified in contemporary documents. At 0500, Nagumo launches his search planes, just 7 aircraft to cover a vast expanse of ocean. By contrast, the Americans have over 30 PBYs searching for the Japanese fleet. Most critically, the search plane from the heavy cruiser Tone, designated as No. 4 Scout and assigned to search the sector where the American carriers actually are, launches 30 minutes late. Various sources attribute this to catapult problems, though some suggest engine trouble or bureaucratic delays. This single mechanical failure will cascade into catastrophe. Ironically, recent scholarship suggests that had the plane launched on time, its search pattern might have missed the American task forces entirely. At 0534, PBY pilot Lieutenant Howard A.D. spots the Japanese carriers and transmits the electrifying message, "Enemy carriers." He follows with more detail at 0552. 2 carriers and battleships bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles, course 135, speed 25. On Enterprise, Spruant makes a command decision that will determine the battle's outcome. Despite the extreme range, nearly 200 m, he orders an immediate strike. His aircraft will have barely enough fuel to return, but he wants to catch the Japanese when they're most vulnerable, recovering their Midway strike. Meanwhile, at 0553, radar on Midway picks up the incoming Japanese strike 93 miles out. Air raid sirens wail across the tiny atoll. Every available aircraft is scrambled. Bombers to attack the Japanese fleet. Fighters to defend. Marine fighters launch into the air. 20 obsolete. Brewster F-2A Buffaloes and 7 Grumman F-4F Wildcats. They are outnumbered 4-1 by the escorting Zeros. The interception occurs at 0616. Marine Major Floyd Parks leading the defenders makes his final radio transmission. Hawks at Angels 14. Supported by fighters. The massacre is swift and brutal. The Zeros with their superior maneuverability and experienced pilots tear through the Marine formation. Within minutes, 13 Marine fighters are shot down, or severely damaged. Major Parks is among the dead. The Zeros lose just 3 planes. At 0630, Tamanaga's strike force arrives over Midway. The dive bombers and level bombers execute their attacks with precision, setting fuel tanks ablaze, destroying buildings, cratering the runway. But as Tamaga circles to assess damage, he sees something troubling. American aircraft are still taking off from the supposedly destroyed airfield. The runway, while damaged, is still operational. Most importantly, none of the American aircraft were caught on the ground. They had all been launched before the strike arrived. At 0700, Tamanaga radios Nagumo. There is need for a second attack wave. This message reaches Nagumo at 0700 just as the first American strikes from Midway begin arriving. First come 6 TBF Avengers and 4 B-26 Marauders carrying torpedoes. The Zeros assigned to combat air patrol swarm them. 5 Avengers are shot down, 2 B-26 destroyed. But 1 B-26, nicknamed Susie Q and piloted by Lieutenant James Murray, makes a desperate run directly at Akagi after dropping his torpedo. According to multiple Japanese witnesses, including bridge personnel, the bomber roared down the length of Agi's flight deck, its gunners strafing and killing 2 sailors. The plane pulled up at the last second, barely clearing the bridge where Nagumo and his staff ducked for cover. Mori's aircraft sustained over 500 bullet holes and lost hydraulic fluid, but somehow made it back to Midway. A second B-26, piloted by Lieutenant Herbert Mays and heavily damaged, actually crashed into the ocean near Akagi's bridge, possibly attempting a deliberate ramming attack. This near miss has a profound psychological effect. As Captain Kusaka would later testify, the admiral was visibly shaken. To have an enemy plane nearly crash into the bridge, it was as if the war god had given us a warning. More American attacks follow in rapid succession. 16 Marine dive bombers led by Major Lofton Henderson, who would be killed leading his squadron. 15 B-7 bombing from high altitude, 11 Marine Vindicators. All are repulsed with heavy losses, scoring no hits, but they keep the Japanese carriers dodging and weaving, unable to conduct flight operations efficiently. At 0715, Nagumo faces a critical decision. His reserve aircraft are armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for ship attack. But Tamanaga needs support at Midway, and no enemy carriers have been spotted. After heated discussion with his staff, Nagumo issues the order that seals his fate. Remove torpedoes. Load land attack bombs. This violates Yamamoto's explicit orders to maintain readiness for anti-ship operations. Down in the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, chaos erupts. Ordnance crews begin the laborious process of removing Type 91 torpedoes and 800 kilograms armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with smaller land attack munitions. Against regulations and safety protocols, the removed torpedoes are stacked in the hangar spaces rather than being returned to the magazines far below. There isn't time. Bombs are piled near the aircraft. Fuel hoses snake everywhere as planes are refueled. As one mechanic, Airman Mai would later testify if he had survived. The hangar deck looked like a bomb factory. One spark and we would all be dead. At 0728, everything changes. The Tones delayed scout plane number 4 finally reports Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 0-10 degrees. Distance 240 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Nagumo immediately. Signals ascertain ship types. The response doesn't come for 12 agonizing minutes. Meanwhile, the rhyming continues, the hangar decks becoming increasingly cluttered with ordnance. At 0745, another American strike arrives. 16 Marine dive bombers from VMSB 241 led by Major Henderson. The Zeros savage them, shooting down 8, but the attacks keep coming, forcing violent evasive maneuvers that prevent flight operations. Nagumo is trapped in an impossible position. His fighters are running low on fuel and ammunition from fighting off continuous attacks. Tamaga's strike force will return soon, also low on fuel. His decks are spotted with aircraft being rearmed. And somewhere out there are American surface ships. Possibly carriers. At 0809, tone number 4 Scout finally clarifies. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo breathes a sigh of relief, no carriers, and continues rearming for a second Midway strike. But at 0820, another message shatters his composure. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Rear Admiral Tamman Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division, from Hiryū, immediately signals Nagumo at 0830. Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately. Yamaguchi, aggressive and decisive, sees the danger clearly. Every minute of delay increases vulnerability, but Nagumo hesitates. His aircraft are in chaos. Some armed with bombs, some with torpedoes, many not armed at all. His fighters need to land and refuel. Tamanaga's returning strike is approaching. To launch now would mean a partial uncoordinated attack with no fighter escort, violating every principle of Japanese carrier doctrine. Commander Minorugu Gender, despite his illness from the appendectomy, is consulted. According to staff officer testimonies, he argued for an immediate launch. Speed is everything now. Launch what we have. But Captain Kusaka counsels caution. If we attack peace meal, we'll suffer heavy losses for little gain. Better to recover our aircraft, properly arm them, and launch a fully constituted strike according to doctrine. Nagumo, always cautious, always by the book, sides with Kusaka. We will recover Tom Minogu's force, rearm and refuel properly, and then strike with full strength. He signals all carriers. After completing recovery of aircraft, we shall proceed north to engage the enemy. This decision, logical, prudent, and completely wrong, seals the fate of the Kido Butai. As Tamanaga's planes land starting at 0837 and are struck below to be refueled and rearmed, the hangar decks become death traps. Fuel lines are everywhere. Bombs and torpedoes are scattered about. The constant cycling of elevators brings planes up and down. Safety protocols are completely abandoned in the rush to prepare for launch. No one notices the first American torpedo planes appearing on the horizon until it's too late. At 0920, the first American carrier planes arrive. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornets Torpedo Squadron 8. VT-8 led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Without fighter escort, flying obsolete aircraft at just 100 knots, barely above the waves, they bore in against the entire Japanese fleet. The Zeros on combat air patrol finally with worthy targets after hours of fighting off land-based attacks descend like hawks on pigeons. The massacre is total. One by one, the slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers are shot down. All 15 are destroyed. Of 30 aircrew, only one survives. Enan George Gay, who will float in the water, hiding under his
seat cushion, watching the rest of the battle unfold. Not a single torpedo hits, but Waldron's sacrifice is not in vain.
The Zeros are all drawn down to sea level, focused on the torpedo planes.
At 0954,
14 Devastators from Enterprise's VT-6 arrive, led by Lieutenant Commander
Eugene Lindsay. Again, the Zeros swarm down.
10 are shot down, for escape, no
hits. At 1012 Devastators from Yorktown's VT-3.
Attack led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, 10 more shot down.
Still no torpedo hits.
Of 41 torpedo bombers that attack, only 6 survive.
It seems like another slaughter for nothing.
On the bridge of Akagi, there is relief, even celebration.
The American attacks have
been repulsed with terrible losses.
Nagumo orders the strike force to prepare for launch at 10:30. Victory
seems within grasp, but high above, unnoticed with every Zero at sea level.
2 groups of SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrive simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 33 dive bombers from Enterprise,
had searched beyond his calculated interception point, gambling his fuel to find the Japanese. He had spotted the destroyer Erasure speeding north. It had been depth charging the submarine USS Nautilus and
followed its course directly to the Kido Butai.
Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander
Max Leslie's 17 dive bombers from Yorktown arrived from a different direction at the same moment. At 10:20,
lookouts on Akagi scream, "Helldivers!"
But it's too late. With the
Zeros at sea level, with the decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft, with bombs and torpedoes scattered throughout the hangar spaces, the Japanese carriers are perfectly vulnerable.
At 10:22, McCluskey pushes
over into his dive from 14,500 feet behind him. His squadrons roll into
their attack dives. The rising sun insignia on the carrier decks below grow
larger, becoming perfect targets in the crystalline Pacific morning. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey leads his bombers against Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best takes his
division against Akagi. Almost simultaneously, Leslie's Yorktown bombers plunge towards Sōryū. The
Japanese carriers, recovering from violent evasive maneuvers and with their decks crowded with aircraft, are caught
at their most vulnerable moment. On Kaga, 4 bombs strike in rapid succession. The first, a 1,000-pounder, explodes near the bridge at 10:22, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his command staff instantly.
The second strikes the flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck, where fueled aircraft explode in chain reactions. The third and fourth bombs turn the ship into an inferno.
Within minutes, Kaga is a floating torch with ammunition cooking off an aviation fuel, creating walls of flame. Akagi takes
just 1 direct hit at 1,024 from Lieutenant Best's bomb, but it's enough.
The 1,000-pound bomb penetrates the flight deck and explodes in the upper hangar,
among 18 aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The induced explosions of the
improperly stored ordnance are catastrophic. Torpedoes detonate, bombs
explode, and aviation fuel creates an unstoppable conflagration.
Bridge personnel report that within 2 minutes, the entire hangar deck is an inferno with temperatures exceeding
1,000 degrees Celsius. Sōryū suffers 3 direct hits in her
hangar spaces at 10:25. Lieutenant Leslie's bombers place their ordnance with deadly precision. 13
valves, 3 Zeros, and 4 Kates on the flight deck are blown apart.
Below,
in the hangars, the stacked torpedoes and bombs create secondary explosions that tear through the ship's vitals.
Horror. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto refuses to leave his burning ship. According to the
testimony of Chief Petty Officer Abe, who was sent to rescue him, Yanagimoto was last seen on the bridge, sword in hand, singing the national anthem, Kimageo, as flames engulfed the command
structure.
Only Hiryū, separated from the others by several miles and screened by
Clouds, escapes. Admiral Yamaguchi immediately prepares a counterstrike. But 3/4 of Japan's carrier striking power has been eliminated in 5 minutes. At 10:58, even as the 3 carriers burn, Yamaguchi launches 18 Valdive bombers and 6-0 escorts led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Following the American plane's return track, they find Yorktown at 1200. Despite fierce resistance from Wildcat fighters and anti-aircraft fire, they score 3 bomb hits, leaving the American carrier dead in the water, burning and listing. Damage control. Parties work frantically, and incredibly, within 2 hours, Yorktown is underway again, making 20 knots. Yamaguchi, aggressive to the end, immediately prepares a second strike. At 13:31, only 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros are available, led by Lieutenant Tamanega. During the morning Midway strike, Tamanega's left-wing fuel tank had been damaged. Maintenance crews only had time to fuel his right tank. Offered a chance to switch planes, Tamaga refused, stating every aircraft was needed. He knows it's a one-way mission. His fuel will only last for the attack run. At 14:30, Tamanega's small force finds Yorktown, now making 19 knots after heroic damage control efforts. American fighters tear into the formation. Tamaga holds his course despite his plane catching fire from fighter attacks. According to American witnesses, his burning aircraft maintained its torpedo run until the very last moment, releasing its torpedo before crashing into the sea. 2. Torpedoes hit Yorktown at 14:45, tearing open her port side and causing it 26 degrees. List. This time, the damage is fatal. But at 1700, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise find Hiryū. 4 bombs turn her into another inferno. At 1703, Yamaguchi assembles his crew on the tilting flight deck. According to survivors, he apologized for the defeat, urged them to survive and rebuild a stronger navy, then retired to his bridge with Captain Tomoko Kaku. Both chose to go down with their ship. Their bodies were never recovered. Yamaguchi's final message to Nagumo included an apology for the defeat and a hope for the emperor's fortune in war. He was posthumously promoted to vice admiral. Through the night of June 4 to 5, the surviving Japanese ships attempt damage control, but it's hopeless. Sōryū sinks at 1913 on the 4th. With 711 men. Kaga follows at 1925, taking 811 sailors to the bottom. At 0200 on June 5, Yamamoto, still 600 m away aboard his flagship Yamato with the main body that never engaged, finally accepts reality. He signals occupation of Midway is can-led. Withdraw. Akagi proves surprisingly hard to kill. Despite the raging fires, she remains afloat through the night. At 0500 on June 5, after all survivors are evacuated, Japanese destroyers fire 4 torpedoes into her. She finally sinks, taking 267 men with her. Hiryū, also refusing to die easily, is scuttled at 0510. After burning through the night, she takes 392 sailors and both her admirals into the deep. As the sun rises on June 5, the cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force lies on the bottom of the Pacific in water over 17,000 feet deep. With them are 357 men. Of these, 2,181 died on the carriers. Akagi lost 267. Kaga 811, Hiryū 392, and Sōryū 711. Another 792 died on the heavy cruisers when Makuma was sunk, 700 dead, and Momi damaged, 92 dead, after they collided during night operations and were caught by American aircraft. Crucially, only 110 were aircrew. Most pilots were rescued. The greater irreplaceable loss was over 700 skilled
aircraft mechanics and flight deck personnel whose expertise had taken years to develop. The survivors picked up by destroyers are immediately segregated from the rest of the fleet to prevent news of the disaster from spreading. They are confined below decks, forbidden to communicate with anyone. The disaster isn't quite over. On June 6, the submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanab, finds the crippled Yorktown undertow by USS Vero. Tanab had been off Midway providing weather reports and had watched the morning attacks through his periscope. Now, slipping through the destroyer screen at 3 knots, he achieves what the entire Kido Butai could not. At 13:31, Tanabe fires a spread of 4 torpedoes from 1,200 yards. 2 hit Yorktown. 1 hits the destroyer Hammond alongside, providing auxiliary power. Hammond breaks in 2 and sinks in 4 minutes with 80 dead, many killed by her own depth charges exploding. Yorktown, hit by 2 more torpedoes, is doomed, but refuses to sink immediately. She finally rolls over and sinks at 0701 on June 7 in approximately 16,650 feet of water. This small consolation, sinking the carrier that had helped destroy the Kido Butai, barely registers against the scale of the Japanese defeat. Meanwhile, the heavy cruisers Magami and Mikuma, attempting to bombard Midway on the night of June 4, had collided while avoiding submarine attack. American aircraft find them on June 6. Makuma is sunk with 700 hands, the highest death toll of any Japanese ship at Midway. Momi, heavily damaged and with 92 dead, barely makes it back to Truk. The disaster is complete. The journey home is one of shame and silence. Wounded sailors from the carriers are kept isolated in special compartments. No one is allowed to speak of what happened. When the fleet returns to Japan at Hashima Naval Base on June 14, they anchor at night to avoid observation. The wounded are offloaded in darkness, classified as secret patients, and taken to isolated naval hospitals where they're kept under virtual arrest, quarantined even from their own families. They are forbidden any contact with the outside world. According to U.S. Naval Institute sources, they were treated in an appalling manner as disgraced losers. The survivors of the air groups are immediately reassigned to distant bases in the South Pacific without being allowed to see families or friends. The majority will die in the subsequent battles of the Solomon Islands campaign. The carrier crews are dispersed to different ships and bases, sworn to secrecy under threat of severe punishment. The systematic cover-up begins immediately. The government prepares its propaganda. The sunken carriers Akagi and Hiryū remain on the official roster as unmanned to maintain the fiction they still exist. No flag officers are court-martialed or even officially reprimanded, as this would require admitting defeat. Information about the defeat is withheld from the Imperial Japanese Army for a full month. Even Prime Minister Hideki Tojo is kept in the dark about the full extent of the disaster. On June 5, while the ship still burned, Tokyo Radio had announced to the Japanese people, naval and air forces of the empire have succeeded in inflicting heavy damage on American fleet and air forces in the Central Pacific. Later broadcasts added that Japan had achieved another smashing victory with 2 American carriers sunk. As an aside mentioned almost in passing, the loss of 1 carrier Kaga was acknowledged with Sōryū's loss admitted. Later, Akagi and Hiryū's destruction would not be publicly acknowledged until after the war. The Japanese people celebrated in the streets, unaware they were cheering a catastrophe. It wasn't until June 10 that the Tokyo press first hinted at problems, using vague language about difficulties in the operation, but still maintaining the fiction of overall victory. Commander Fukita recuperating in the hospital from his appendectomy and burns received during Akagi's destruction, is visited by a naval intelligence officer. who warns him, "You are forbidden to speak of what happened. As far as the world knows, we won a great victory." According to post-war accounts that must be treated cautiously given questions about Fuita's reliability, he responded with bitter irony about the futility of building a war on lies. Though this exchange cannot be independently verified. Admiral Yamamoto returns to his cabin aboard Yamato and doesn't emerge for 3 days. His staff hears him pacing at night, tortured by his failure. To his diary, he confides thoughts that would only be discovered after the war. According to staff officers who served with him, Yamamoto fell into deep depression, knowing the war was now unwinnable. His prediction to Prime Minister Konoe had proven prophetic. Japan had indeed run wild for 6 months, exactly as he had foreseen. Now at Midway, occurring precisely 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the tide had turned. In a private meeting with his staff documented by Captain Kuroshima, Yamamoto was brutally frank. "I gambled and lost. In trying to destroy the American carriers, I have lost our own. The war is not lost yet, but I fear I have lost the means to win it." To his close friend, Rear Admiral T-Chi, he would later write a letter that survived the war. The defeat at Midway was not a matter of bad luck or enemy superiority in numbers. It was the result of our own overconfidence and poor planning. We underestimated American capabilities and overestimated our own. Now we will pay the price for our hubris. I give Japan perhaps 18 months before the situation becomes completely hopeless. His prediction would prove optimistic. Within 18 months, Japan would lose the Maranas, and American B-29s would be within range of the home islands. The true cost of Midway extends far beyond the 4 carriers and 357 dead. Japan has lost over 100 of its best pilots, men with years of training and combat experience. From China to the Indian Ocean. The pilot training program, which takes 2 years minimum to produce a combat-ready aviator and far longer to create an expert, cannot replace them. More critically, the 700-plus skilled aircraft mechanics, armorers, and flight deck crew who died represent institutional knowledge that took decades to develop. These men knew every rivet of their aircraft, every quirk of their carrier's operations. As Admiral Ugaki writes in his diary, later captured and translated, "We can build new carriers in 2 years. We cannot build new pilots with the experience of those we lost. And we will never replace the skilled maintenance crews who knew how to keep our aircraft flying under combat conditions." The real tragedy of Midway is not the ships, but the men. The Japanese naval aviation never recovers. At the Battle of the Philippines Sea 2 years later in June 1944, inexperienced Japanese pilots will be massacred in what Americans call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviators flying against veteran American pilots in superior aircraft lose over 600 planes while inflicting minimal damage. The seeds of that disaster were planted in the waters off Midway. Midway marks the end of Japanese expansion. Within the Imperial General Headquarters, the reality slowly sinks in. Despite the propaganda, the planned invasions of Fiji, Samoa, and Hawaii are quietly cancelled. The proposed Operation FS to cut the supply lines between America and Australia is abandoned. Instead, Japan is forced into a defensive war it cannot win. The Americans, their confidence soaring, begin planning their counter-offensive. Guadalcanal, just 2 months away, will begin the long, bloody American advance toward Japan. The psychological impact is equally devastating. The Japanese Navy's aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated since the victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905, is shattered forever.
As one destroyer captain, Commander Tamekihara, recalled in his
memoirs, after Midway, we never felt confident again.
We went into battle expecting to lose. The Americans went in expecting to win.
The whole psychology of the war had changed in those 5 minutes when our carriers were hit. Within the Navy itself, bitter
recriminations begin immediately, though never publicly. Admiral Nagumo, made a
scapegoat for the defeat despite following orthodox doctrine, is relegated to shore duty. He will never command
carriers again.
In 1944, during the American invasion of Saipan, where he commands ground forces, he commits suicide rather than face capture.
Admiral Akagi writes in his diary, Nagumo is finished as a commander. The blame must fall on someone, and it cannot be Yamamoto. The defeat also exposes fundamental
flaws in Japanese military culture. The inflexibility of thinking, the inability to adapt to unexpected situations, the blind adherence to doctrine even when circumstances change. All these cultural traits that contributed to the defeat are recognized but cannot be changed.
The same rigid hierarchy and thinking
that led to disaster at Midway will be repeated again and again throughout the war.
Post-war analysis reveals the
cascade of failures that led to disaster.
The Japanese operation was too complex, with forces scattered across thousands of miles, unable to support each other.
Radio silence maintained
religiously prevented any coordination when plans went awry. Intelligence was abysmal.
The Japanese had no idea American carriers were already at sea, while the Americans knew every detail of
Japanese plans thanks to their code breaking.
The failure of reconnaissance was particularly damning. Only 7 search planes to cover a vast ocean area compared to over 30 American
PBY Catalinas.
The cancelled Operation K reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor due to
American presence at French frigate shoals.
The submarine cordon arriving too late to detect American carriers
leaving Pearl Harbor.
The Tone's crucial half-hour delay in launching its scout plane. Each failure individually might not have been fatal. Together, they guaranteed disaster.
Perhaps most critically, the Japanese underestimated American capabilities while overestimating their own.
They assumed Americans couldn't
break their codes. They had. They assumed Yorktown couldn't be repaired quickly.
She was fixed in 72 hours. They assumed American pilots were inferior.
At Midway, American dive bomber pilots
proved devastatingly effective.
They assumed American carriers would arrive after Midway was captured. They were waiting in ambush.
The damage control failures were equally telling.
Japanese
carriers with enclosed hangar decks and inadequate firefighting systems became death traps when hit.
American carriers with open hangar decks and superior damage control proved far more survivable. Yorktown took tremendous punishment and might have survived if not for the submarine attack.
The Japanese carriers burned
catastrophically from single hits due to poor fuel system design and inadequate ammunition handling procedures. Admiral Yamamoto does not long survive the defeat he knew doomed Japan. On April 18, 1943, American Coderers intercept his travel schedule.
P-38 Lightning fighters intercept his plane over Bougainville and shoot it down.
His death, exactly 1 year after the Diddle raid that had precipitated Midway, seems almost poetic justice.
Found in the jungle, still strapped to his seat.
Sword at his side, Yamamoto takes to his grave the full knowledge of how Japan lost the war in those 5 minutes at Midway.
Before his death, in one of his last letters to a friend that survived the war, Yamamoto reflected with
remarkable clarity.
At Midway, we learned that wars are not won by spiritual strength alone.
They
are won by intelligence, both kinds, good information, and the wisdom to use it properly.
We had neither. We were too
proud to believe the Americans could be waiting for us, too rigid to adapt when our plans went wrong, and too arrogant
to admit our codes might be broken.
Pride goeth before a fall, and our pride
was limitless. The result was inevitable. The greatest irony of Midway is that it achieved Yamamoto's goal just in reverse. It was indeed the decisive
battle he had sought, but it was Japan, not America, that was decisively defeated. The carriers he had tried to
trap had instead trapped him.
The ambush he had planned became the ambush he suffered.
The decisive battle doctrine
that Japanese naval strategy had been built upon for 40 years was proven correct.
But it was the Americans who won it. As documented in Japanese military archives, Yamamoto had genuinely feared American industrial might.
In early 1942, he told his staff, "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy.
It is more a matter of shame. Simply for the one smitten. I would rather you made your appraisal after seeing what the enemy does, since it is
certain that angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack." At Midway, that counterattack arrived with devastating efficiency.
The
Americans had not only recovered from Pearl Harbor, but had turned Japanese strategy against them.
The war would
continue for 3 more years, but its outcome was effectively decided in those 5 minutes on June 4, 1942. But beyond the strategic implications, Midway was fundamentally a human tragedy.
In the waters 325 miles northwest of Midway, 357 Japanese sailors and airmen died.
Young men who had written final letters to their families that morning, who had shared rice and tea for breakfast, who had dreams of victory and
home.
They died in flames that reached 1,000 degrees, drowned in oil-slicked waters, or were
torn apart by explosions that could be heard miles away. Lieutenant Hashimoto, one of the few
survivors from Akagi's engine room, testified at post-war investigations. "The screams of burning men echo in my nightmares still.
We couldn't save them.
The passages were blocked by fire.
The ladders melted from heat. We could only listen as they died.
Their voices calling for their mothers, for water, for death to end their agony.
Every night I hear them still. The families back home never learned the truth during the war.
They received notices that their sons died gloriously for the emperor in a great victory. Mothers hung gold stars in their windows, proud of their sacrifice, never knowing it was for a defeat that sealed Japan's fate.
The truth would only emerge after the war, adding betrayal to grief.
Many families refused to believe it even then, so complete had been the
deception." Petty Officer Tanaka, who survived Sōryū's sinking, recalled the morning before the battle. "We were so confident. We joked about which American ship we would sink. Yamada said he would sink a battleship.
Suzuki claimed he would shoot down 5 American planes.
They were both 18 years old. Both died when the bombs hit.
Their bodies were never
recovered.
Sometimes I wonder if they're still down there, standing at their posts, waiting for orders that will
never come."
Today, the 4 Japanese carriers rest in over 17,000 feet of
water. Their exact locations only recently discovered by deep-sea explorer
Robert Ballard and subsequent expeditions. They are war graves, monuments to the
price of hubris and the cost of war.
The aircraft that once launched from their decks to spread destruction across the
Pacific lie crumpled in their hangar bays. The bones of their crews remain at
their battle stations. Eternal guardians of ships that will never sail again.
From the Japanese perspective, Midway represents the moment when dreams of empire collided catastrophically with reality.
It was proof that spiritual strength alone cannot overcome material
weakness. That courage without intelligence leads to disaster, that rigid thinking cannot adapt to fluid situations. It was Japan's appointment with destiny, and destiny proved merciless. The Midway defeat shattered more than ships and lives. It shattered illusions. The myth of Japanese invincibility, the faith in spiritual superiority over material strength, the belief that determination could overcome any odds. All died with the carriers. In their place came the grim recognition that Japan had started a war it could not win. Against an enemy it had fatally underestimated, using strategies that modern warfare had rendered obsolete. Yet from the ashes of defeat came a different Japan, one that renounced war, embraced democracy, and became a force for peace and prosperity. The samurai spirit that once drove conquest now drives innovation. The nation that once sought to dominate the Pacific now helps maintain its peace. The technological expertise that once built carriers now builds cars and computers. In that transformation, perhaps the 357 who died at Midway did not die entirely in vain. The battle also stands as a warning to all nations about the dangers of overconfidence and rigid thinking. The Japanese military, despite its tactical brilliance and brave personnel, fell victim to its own success. Victory disease. The assumption that what worked before will always work, that the enemy will act as expected, that superior spirit will overcome material disadvantage, infected decision-making at every level. The same Navy that had brilliantly executed the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier, now bungled basic reconnaissance, ignored intelligence warnings, and walked into a trap that should have been obvious. As we look back at Midway from the Japanese perspective, we see not villains, but human beings caught in the terrible machinery of war. Young pilots who flew to their deaths with courage, if not wisdom. Commanders making decisions with incomplete information, under impossible pressure. Mechanics working frantically to prepare aircraft they would never see again. Sailors fighting fires that could not be controlled, staying at their posts until the end. Their story deserves to be recounted, not to glorify defeat or warfare, but to honor the cost of military aggression and the toll of imperial ambition. Lieutenant Commander Fukita, despite lingering questions about his post-war credibility, perhaps captured something essential when he became a Christian evangelist after the war and devoted his remaining years to preaching reconciliation. While his specific recollections must be approached with caution, his transformation from architect of Pearl Harbor to advocate for peace mirrors the journey Japan itself undertook, from aggression to pacifism, from empire to democracy, from isolation to international cooperation. The lesson of Midway from the Japanese perspective is ultimately that no nation, however powerful, can afford to underestimate its adversaries, overrate its own abilities, or ignore the evolving realities of warfare. The very carriers that had seemed invincible at Pearl Harbor proved fatally exposed at Midway. The same pilots who had dominated all opposition encountered their match in American dive bombers. The strategies that had succeeded against divided foes faltered against a united and well-informed enemy. In the end, the waters that swallowed the Japanese carriers at Midway were the same waters that would eventually sweep away the militarism that sent them there. The young men who perished believed they were defending their emperor and empire. They could not have known they were, in fact, dying for the birth of a new Japan, peaceful, prosperous, and democratic. Their sacrifice, though tactically futile and strategically disastrous, helped underscore the futility of military aggression and the impossibility of sustaining an empire by force. This is the Battle of Midway from the Japanese viewpoint, a tale of pride before the fall, of human error compounding into catastrophe, of young lives lost to strategic misjudgment. It is a story that deserves to be recounted, not to celebrate defeat or triumph, but to remember the human cost of war and the burden of empire. Ultimately, the waves that engulfed the Japanese carriers at Midway were the same waves that would eventually cleanse the stains of militarism, leaving behind a transformed nation and a lesson for all humanity, that the path of aggression leads only to destruction, and that genuine strength resides not in conquest but in peace. The spirits of Midway, both Japanese and American, remind us that war is not glorious but grim, not victorious but tragic, and that peace, however fragile, is always preferable to even the most decisive victory. In the vast Pacific, where the carriers remain in their silent graves,
The only sound is the eternal rhythm of the waves, bearing neither Japanese nor American voices, but simply the echo of humanity's costliest lesson, that war, regardless of who prevails, leaves only loss in its wake.